So it is very clear that religious traditions, spiritual traditions affect people's views of the environment, at least some of the time, which shouldn't be terribly surprising given that religions very often have to do with the society's cosmology and cosmogony, or in other words, their view of what the world is and how it came to be. So it's not shocking, since humans are not the only entities in said world, that many religious and spiritual traditions, arguably all or most, have a degree of teachings to varying degrees about ecosystems, environments, animals, and plants, and that is then helps shape the worldview of the people who participate therein. I'd like to talk about a few examples, though, and as we're talking about this, we're talking about a field of study, a body of work that's been described in different ways. The one that I had you do a reading by Leslie Sponsel where he was describing this as spiritual ecology, the study of, as he likes to say, the interface between religion and ecology. In his point of view, not just the study of it, but also the advocacy of a more environmentally informed religion. But that's a topic for later in the lecture. But for now, our focus is the study of the interface of religion and ecology. So, for example, as in this image, when Navajo people, as I've talked about before, advocate for the protection of the confluence of the Colorado and Little Colorado River on the grounds that for some local people, they consider this to be the place of emergence, where holy beings from a time when animals and humans, or rather holy humans, holy beings, interacted a lot more, that this is where they emerged into the present world. That's a concept of that's a spiritual ecology kind of topic, right? Looking at how sacred traditions affect people's views of the environment. In this case, both views of animals as once having been much closer to human beings and being people in their own regard, to insect people, bird people that they encounter along the way, but also affecting the environment in the sense that in the present day world, this influences how some local Navajo people saw and thought about this tourism development, and was one of many factors, and I want to highlight that, one of several factors, but one factor which contributed to people's rejection of a proposal regarded to a resort development there. That would have been quite impactful. So this is an example of spiritual ecology. There are other terms as well that are sometimes used, such as religious ecology, sacred ecology, religion and ecology, eco-theology, although that's kind of its own thing. But the point is we're talking about the interface of people's religious views and their ecological views. And one need go no further, of course, than the 20 different Alaska Native language groups and culture groups here, or cultures here in Alaska, to see a lot of different examples of ecologies with very overt spiritual dimensions and relational dimensions, by which I mean that the views of the ecosystem are predicated not on the idea of human beings as fundamentally separate, but instead on the idea of human beings as fundamentally in a symbiotic relationship with the animals around them. Now, I want to emphasize before I provide a few examples that of the 20 different Alaska Native languages and the hundreds of different communities, literally, there's tremendous variation in how different groups understand and speak about the environment. I am very much, what's the word for an anti-advocate? I'm very much against when people homogenize Alaska Native ways of knowing into one theme that's palatable or easy to understand for non-native audiences. I think that really denies the richness and complexity of these worldviews. Having said that, we can note a few common themes, I think. I wouldn't say universal across all Alaska Native groups, but recurring in several different groups, and I'd like to point them out and share some examples. One concept would be rebirth. I might say that better as animals returning when they've choosing to return from the spirit world when their bodies have been properly respected. So, for example, traditionally in Dena'ina cosmology, the idea that animals' bones needed to be properly disposed of in the water or in fire, depending on if they were a water animal or a fire animal, and that this would allow the animals to properly return to the spirit world and then eventually return back to human beings. That by showing respect, the animals then chose to come back to your community and allow themselves to be offered again, which relates to point number 2, the idea that animals are choosing to be hunted. We see that those two themes also in Yupik stories about geese, where geese and other animals are viewed as coming back, returning, if they are properly respected. You see this as well in Alitik, Shukpiak, stories about whaling, and traditionally the idea that and Aleut concepts of whaling, but this idea of that whales choose to offer themselves, and that especially that one can put an image of a well-crafted image of a whale at the bottom of one's kayak, and therefore attract the attention of a whale, and the whale sees you're a respectful person that respects me, I'll offer myself to be hunted. So a very different model of hunting than this sort of idea of we go out and chase an animal down or we capture it. As the Denina example shares from a minute ago, also rituals of respect is a reoccurring theme, not a universal one necessarily, but definitely a reoccurring one in many cultures where there's a very certain way in which one is to dispose of the dead, for example, to show respect to those animals as beings. Also prohibitions sometimes on eating certain animals, such as wolves within traditional Denina teachings, based on spiritual concepts, such as the idea that wolves used to be human beings, as Cornelius Asgood found out in his research in the 1930s. A final theme I would mention is the idea in many Alaska Native spiritual ecologies, and I'm talking here about traditional beliefs prior to Christianity. Introduction, many Alaska Native people today are Christian, although I will note also that in many cases people do still take on elements from their traditional cultural beliefs into their modern Christianity beliefs, or people combine them in complex ways. Some people reject Christianity. There's all sorts of different relationships with both traditional beliefs and Christian religious beliefs. But what I was going to say is that in several of the Alaska Native groups, there is a concept that there was a time period when the lines between humans and animals were much more blurry. They could communicate better than they do now. They could interact more regularly. And so you see that, for example, in Gwich'in teachings about caribou, and many other teachings in Denina, teachings about raven, and many others that we could mention. For example, Tlingit cosmogony. So in Tlingit in the lower southeast, there should be an aspirated L on the L, I apologize. And a writing by Nancy Furlow, a Tlingit scholar called Angun Remembers, she says the story, she's talking about a modern day historical event, but she says the story must begin with Raven. Raven created the Tlingit world, and the Raven stories tell us how Raven's cunning made our world what it is today, how he stole the sun, moon, and stars and brought light to the world, or how water dripping from his beak became our rivers and lakes. So a very different paradigm, not necessarily one that doesn't align with, but one that tells the story certainly in a different way of sort of the arrival of rivers and lakes into that area, not one that's just solely talking about, let's say, glaciers receding or something like that, or hydrology, but one that talks about the active presence of Raven in the past. She says the Raven stories highlight a time when the boundaries between the human and natural worlds and worlds of the spirits were fluid, and communication and exchanges took place easily. Even though communication between these realms is no longer as direct, it remains very important. The world's a spiritual world, a sensible feeling world. Strict rules guide behavior between the human, natural, and spiritual worlds. Now, anytime, I'll talk about this more next week, but anytime that we're talking about indigenous views of a spiritual sort of inhabitation within ecology, we need to understand that that doesn't always mean the same thing as that all animals or all spirits interact in a good way with human beings. And indeed, we can think of many Alaska Native groups where there are stories, for example, of monstrous beings that can afflict people out there that would be part of the environment, right? In the sense of environment being that which surrounds. So it doesn't always mean that just because nature has spirits or is spiritual, it doesn't always mean those are positive things. We'll return to that theme in a bit. But often there is that connotation of respect for these beings, for these persons. On that note, Yupik non-human persons. Again, traditionally in Yupik cosmology, animals go to other worlds, experience rebirth, geese decide to return. There's also a lot of interesting stories about geese that suggest that geese, as well as other animals, are people-like in nature, even though, again, they're covered with an animal kind of appearance. As Charles Friday from Hooper Bay recounted to Anthony up Riordan, the geese brought him a boy with them. When it was time, the grandfather, this is a boy that kind of, I think, mysteriously appeared. When it was time, the grandfather did a kanikun, a shamanistic rite involving incantation, and taught the boy how to fly, because the boy had appeared from the geese. When the boy learned to fly, he migrated with them. They were like people across on the other side. So this idea of animal beings as persons underneath that can transform into animals, or at least that there was a time when that happened regularly. There's also a story about a young girl that eats in the grass. I think I shared this in an earlier lecture. They come to find out eventually that she is a goose, and she puts on like a goose feather coat and then flies away with the geese. So we can definitely see that in Alaska Native groups, this idea of religion and sacred teachings profoundly influencing how people think about nature to the point of understanding animals as persons. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not eaten, that doesn't mean that they're not hunted and killed, but understanding them as persons, which is, of course, a bit of a different framing than how many people view it in contemporary United States, although some people do view it that way. Religions often endow nature then with a sacredness, with a set-apartness, with a holiness, with a sense of the mysterious, the mystic, the different, the sentient, I think is the biggest point I want to bring up. The idea that nature is not sort of a passive object, but a sentiently involved in our life, making active choices. We could talk about, for example, with the Kwakwakwa group in British Columbia, modern British Columbia, sometimes called by anthropologists Kwakiutl. Early on, you may be more familiar with that term. There's a story in that tradition called Day Hunter and Night Hunter. It's a favorite of mine, and it talks about a hunter, a young chief's son, who was in a competition with his brother to catch more seals. He finds a seal cave where the seals hang out when they're not up swimming around like these guys, and he thinks he's hit pay dirt here. But what he discovers is that he's hit pay dirt a little bit more than he thought. Not only has he found their hiding place or their sleeping place, but he has found that when they take off their seal coverings, there's people underneath. To get him to kind of not go blabbing about it, they end up giving him a staff of power that he then takes back. And wreaks some vengeance on the people who have afflicted him in the past. It's a fascinating story, but again, a testament to this idea of non-human persons, which manifests in a lot of different ways, and I'm not trying to homogenize here, but is a reoccurring theme in several indigenous views of the world. We could talk also about Hindu views of the Ganges. So this Hinduism is nothing if not incredibly diverse, but certainly a very reoccurring and common theme is the concept of the Ganges River as itself holy, and specifically the concept of the Ganges, several different concepts. The idea that it emanates from the feet of Vishnu and therefore is full of blessing. The idea that it is the personification of the great goddess Ganga. That it flows out of the Himalayas, out of the hairs of Shiva. So several different kinds of concepts. Shiva being a usually in English glossed as like a destroyer god, but also kind of like creative destruction. And Vishnu, of course, is a preserving god, one of whose avatars is Krishna in the famous story Bhagavad Gita. So the Ganges then is directly connected to these deities. It's a good example, by the way, of the fact that although we have lots of examples of sort of sacred ecological views that are tied in with the idea of animal spirits, it doesn't necessarily always have to be that. It can also be anthropomorphic or human-like deities who themselves consecrate certain kinds of things or embody themselves in certain kinds of things, like a river for the goddess Ganga. And that river is considered by many devout Hindus in India that there are certain parts of it where bathing in it can help you be purified from past misdeeds, or there's even a specific part where scattering ashes is believed to help people secure a better rebirth or a heavenly state in the hereafter. So profound stuff. Now, this is also a good example, though, of the fact that just because something affects people's views of something doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be in every single instance well protected. The Ganges is certainly not without its environmental issues, like many of the major rivers of the world, including them hydroelectric dams and some of the impacts that can come from that, as well as there's been some pollution concerns in the past as well. So, worth noting. Many more examples we could share around the world. I put here Hamblakaya, so that's the crying for a vision practice, what's sometimes glossed in English as vision quest among Lakota people. Similar practices among other Plains Native American tribes. But the practice historically, if not still at present to some degree, of people fasting and then going into my apologies for the sneeze. People fasting and going into nature to find their purpose in life and staying there until they find it, and oftentimes being contacted by a spirit who may manifest as an anthropomorphic being, a human-like being, but often as an animal being. This is one of the origins of the common phrase in English spirit animal, and I want to emphasize for those of you who are listening that if you use that term casually and are not somebody who practices these beliefs, these practices, I don't think it's the most respectful thing in the world, and I think a lot of indigenous people would say the same thing, and I'd advise you to think about maybe other ways to talk about that same concept. It's easy to fall into those patterns of speech when they're so prevalent in our society, but that doesn't make them a good pattern of speech, and there's a much richer tradition here that's sort of being overly simplified, characterized, misused, if you kind of just use it that way. Again, though, the concept sacredness here doesn't always mean Bambi. Something being a spiritual entity doesn't mean it's always safe to humans, but it does mean that it is an entity, as an entity with animacy and sentience in a different way, perhaps, than it's sometimes viewed. Good example of that, a couple of good examples of views of nature that are spiritual ecology, that are clear examples of religion affecting people's environmental views, but perhaps not in a way that causes them to like the environment perhaps around them. In Uratman society traditionally, which is a Papua New Guinean group, they converted very rapidly to a charismatic form of Christianity in the mid-20th century. Previous to this, they had a system of worship and ceremony that revolved around ancestor veneration, veneration of the goddess Ifalek, I think is the name, but I might be misstating it. If so, I apologize. But they also believed in the motobil, which are these spirits of the forest that had to be sort of appeased or propitiated if you were going to go out to do hunting. You did like an offering to them to make sure that they would treat you well while you were out there hunting. Later, after Christianization, people viewed motobil, as well as ancestor spirits more generally, as a problem rather than entities to be sort of respected. They were sort of, these are the beings we used to be subservient to before we found Christ. And so a lot of the ancestor objects were, so first of all, the motobil to begin with were kind of these like morally gray characters or beings, spirits that could afflict you while you were out hunting if you didn't do things right. And now people have taken some of that a step further and taken ancestor veneration objects, like bags of bones, for example, thrown those into a cave in this one village that Joel Robbins studied, and then people now avoid the cave, and as a result of avoiding the cave, they avoid the cave because it's this concept of like that's associated with these past evil spirits that we used to be subservient to before Christianity. As a result of avoiding the cave where they put these ancestral objects, the forest has now grown really tall/dense there because people don't like go there to harvest wood or anything like that. It's a really interesting example of how sometimes religion can affect people's environmental behaviors in very indirect, odd ways, right? It's not as if people set up the cave belief up or put their bones in that cave as a means of creating a nature preserve, but that's effectively what happened. Another example would be among farmers in Campeche, which is part of southern Mexico, studied by Nora Hain. She talks about the fact that people in this area, mestizo farmers and others, that they view, there's a common widespread belief in the concept of duendes, of trickster spirits from kind of Mayan cosmology that reside in the forest that have to be again, kind of propitiated or dealt with. And since the arrival of evangelical Christianity, specifically the shift from Catholicism to evangelical Christianity, many people view the duendes as very much a problem and sort of evil out there in the woods. And people tell stories to begin with anyways. Duendes were always kind of problematic. They tell stories about duendes like kidnapping people and stuff like that. So the forest as a place of these sort of hostile spirits. We could, proliferate examples if we wanted to. This is one of them. And I'm going to actually pause here because I'm hoping that I need to adjust some settings, but I'm hoping what happens is that I can show you a video and then have that video actually record. You're going to be YouTubing a video of me YouTubing something. So we're getting real meta here. So I'm going to pause the video here for now.